Iran is one of the world's oldest civilizations and was a flourishing nation, rich in diverse cultures and oil resources. So how did they become the rogue nation they are today? It's a result of America's long history of dependence and foreign policies on oil, coupled with a geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union. From Iran's perspective, they have consistently opposed Western imperialism. Their hatred was further stoked by America's control of oil in the region, while supporting Iran's dictatorship regime. It all culminated in 1979, when the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was stormed and hostages were captured by Iran militants, causing an international diplomatic crisis, changing the course of U.S. politics. Let's take a look at the background, role of diplomacy, and the consequences of the Iran hostage crisis. It all started in 1953 when the U.S. overthrew the Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, a proponent of secular democracy, when he nationalized Iran's oil deposits. Then, the U.S. restored Mohammad Reza Pahlavi into power as the Shah, or king, to acquire access to the oil held by Iran. America had a close relationship with him through successive U.S. presidents, while supporting his nuclear program. Over time, the Shah's autocratic rule and westernization programs caused widespread discontent among Iranians. Many people were denied basic humanitarian rights and mistreated by his secret police, Savak. Later, in the 1970s, America was thriving, with people rocking out to music, glued to their televisions, and indulging in their latest automobiles. In the meantime, Iranians revolted against the Shah, rioting and demanding that he be arraigned on trial, which led him to flee the country to Egypt in January 1979. Then, Islamic scholar named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini became the leader, establishing Iran as an Islamic republic. The U.S. president at the time, Jimmy Carter, agreed to let the Shah into America in October 1979 to be treated for cancer. This further enraged the Iranians. On November 4, 1979, the takeover began. Many diplomats were performing their daily tasks when hordes of angry Iranian student militants began storming towards the embassy, climbing over the gates and entering the building. The Marines attacked back, but an inner circle of revolutionaries held 63 embassy workers hostage, parading them around with blindfolds. As news of the hostages broke out in America, people were shocked. Jimmy Carter and other world leaders demanded that the hostages be released, but Iran refused and directed America to release the Shah to be put on trial. Carter had to carefully weigh his constitution-based options and diplomacy to counter the demands of Iran while exercising restraint to not endanger the hostages. It was then he established two main goals for America: protect the honor and vital interests of the U.S. and maintain the well-being and enable the safe release of the hostages as soon as possible. Over the next few weeks, Khomeini directed the militants to release the women and African Americans. Later, 6 diplomats who had evaded capture were aided and hid by the Canadian ambassador and returned home. However, 52 hostages still remained in captivity. As the crisis continued for a few months, Carter called upon America's allies and the United Nations to pass resolutions to urge Iran to release the hostages, to no success. America then applied to the International Court of Justice for a ruling that Iran violated international law, but Iran rejected the order. Meanwhile, in America, riots were staged across many cities as people grew outraged by Carter's diplomacy and demanded warfare, which was also reflected by music at that time. Carter had to also deal with other issues, such as the conflict between Egypt and Israel and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He also had to prepare for the upcoming presidential election. America then decided to cut oil flows from Iran to the U.S. to convince Iran to negotiate the crisis, but to no avail. Carter also directed all Iranian assets in the U.S. to be frozen. Shipment of any military equipment to Iran was halted and virtually all trade with Iran was ceased. In the early months of 1980, the UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim arrived in Tehran for negotiations, but large, volatile anti-American demonstrations stalled the negotiations. Meanwhile, in America, the unfolding of the crisis caught the attention of households across the nation who were glued to their TVs every day. Yellow ribbons became the symbol of hope for the safe return of the hostages. In early April 1980, America decided to place additional economic sanctions on Iran. This included kicking out Iranian diplomats from the US, stopping all trade, and revoking visas of all Iranians in the US. This instilled fear in the Iranians in the US. Jimmy Carter finally resorted to a rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw. This mission faced many challenges with failed helicopters that led to Carter ordering withdrawal. But when the crew lifted off, 2 of the aircrafts collided and 8 crew members were killed, and several others were injured. In reaction to the failed rescue plan, Khomeini began to move the hostages around to different locations, preventing any contacts. Due to America's sanctions, the nation was in a financial crisis. Later, in September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, further weakening the economy. When the Shah died, Iran offered to free the hostages in return for the frozen assets. America refused in order to keep the pressure on Iran. Iran went to the UN for help, but many world leaders threatened that Iran could not expect support if they held onto the hostages. The Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Ali Rajai, finally agreed to negotiate. Iran insisted that there be no direct negotiations. Instead, Algerian and Swiss diplomats posed as middlemen throughout the negotiations. Eventually, on September 12, 1980, Khomeini put forth Iran's conditions to their parliament to release the hostages. He demanded the return of assets and property seized by the Shah, canceling the financial claims against Iran, and pledging not to interfere in Iran's affairs. The Algerian diplomats responded back to Iran, confirming America's acceptance of the resolution in principle. Finally, on January 19th, the Algiers Accord was signed, and on January 20th, 1981, after 444 days, the hostages were released, only minutes after the inauguration of the new U.S. President, Ronald Reagan. At last, they were safe and were welcomed to America with joyous celebrations and relief across the nation. This prolonged crisis impacted many factors of American politics. It caused the end of the Carter presidency, resulting in a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan. Since the crisis, sanctions have become a reliable diplomacy tool for the U.S. in negotiations. After the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, the U.S. began to introduce major reforms to strengthen their military power. The crisis was also a significant loss for Iran. They lost all international support and failed to receive any of their assets. Iran was branded a rogue nation and became an isolated country. The Iran hostage crisis was the result of America's self-indulgence and overconsumption of oil, and their long history of geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union. That, combined with Iran's rejection of westernization, resulted in the broken relationship between the once allies. Diplomatic actions have played a key role throughout this issue. From the overthrow of Mossadegh, U.S. relations with the Shah, the Iran Revolution, the hostage crisis, and Iran's current isolation. Carter practiced patient diplomacy that took its toll but led to the eventual release of the hostages. As Madeleine Albright, America's Secretary of State, said later in 2001, "Neither Iran nor we can forget the past. It has scarred us both."